Greeting, comrades, and welcome to the Southwest is Red, the podcast in which we discuss the latest news about the Global South from a Latin American perspective with a Chinese twist. I'm one of your hosts, Nico.
And I'm your other host, Pedro. Today we have an episode that is in some sense the continuation of the previous episode, so if you couldn't listen to it, I think it would be a good idea to go back and give it a try. But don't worry, you will still know what we are talking about.
I think that only if you have been living under a rock, you would be unaware of the effects of Liberation Day in the world economy. And if you are living under a rock, you probably are not listening to this podcast. Or to any podcast, in fact. I hear reception is patchy down there. But let me get back on topic. Last week, we more or less started talking about the meaning of Liberation Day for the hegemony of the U.S. We talked about three possible futures that could arise from this event. A return to the pure unipolarity of the 90s, if Trump's plan is somehow successful. Then we mentioned a second option that would be the profundization of the cracks in the unipolar world. And finally, we mentioned a third option that would be the establishment or strengthening of a multipolar world. I think that, Pedro, you were more inclined to the third option.
Yes, for me it's the third option, but to be honest, the things are not so bright or easy to be summarized as the strengthening of the multipolarity. I believe this arrangement will be only achieved after a series of international events that may sound a bit alarming for us. I don't know, sorry, not sorry for starting the program being so pessimistic, but I think we should remain attached to reality as much as possible, right? Especially when we talk about some not so hypothetical scenarios or predictions.
No, don't worry about being pessimistic. I'm even worse because I try to be very cautious with my predictions. I also think that this is important in a practical sense to have this attitude of caution, because the thing with Marxists is that we like to combine theory or practice, or we think that theory and practice are intertwined. And in a situation like this, where the tension is rising and the situation is unpredictable in a sense, this conflict between theory and practice is an interesting thing to have to deal with. Because we need to analyze the situation in order to answer the question of what is to be done. But we also need to prepare ourselves for different possibilities. So we need flexibility, but also a flexibility that is restricted to actual possibilities. And it's a difficult balance to achieve, an ability that can be, of course, seen in people like Lenin or Mao Zedong. But for us, grassroots levels, foot soldiers, it's not so easy to achieve.
Okay, good way of giving a no answer, my guy. But I know where you're coming from. I mean, in fact, in this past week, everyone has seen the limits of any kind of predictions. We are getting ready for a trade war between the U.S. and the whole world, but instead there was a change of heart, a change in his mind. I don't know, he's crazy, we say that already, in the Trump administration, and now we have a 90-day pause on most tariffs, and the conflict seems to be reduced, again, to only China. And this is related to many of the things that we spoke about in the previous episode. For example, even though models can be useful, that doesn't mean they are 100% reliable. I mentioned that we are currently experiencing a phase of decline and the legitimization of the U.S. American empire. But recognizing this pattern isn't the same as saying that they will fall by next Thursday, even if I believe that some of our listeners now, and me of course, are hoping that I am mistaken, that it's going to happen, right? And talking about empires, we also spoke about how they organize and maintain themselves. The British managed to hold the hegemon's mantle for quite some time before letting his bastard son take it. And it's important to notice that two global-scale wars were necessary to shatter the Victorian world order. And remember that we mentioned this paranoia thing in international relations? For some leaders and relevant people in the charge of the decision-making process, foreign policy is about suspicion and deception. Living with a constant fear that you can't really trust anyone, it's totally unhealthy. We know that. But that is how the things are. There's a saying that goes, be careful when you point your finger at someone, because at the same time, there are other three fingers aiming back at you. Or something like that. I'm not crazy about quotes as you, my hermano, but This saying is somehow useful to explain our views on what we are going to discuss next, the fear of China. Being so suspicious and aggressive towards a nation that never acted as a global policeman, for me, it's because you're just projecting something that you would totally do in their place. And, well, I think they did it for quite some time already, right?
I agree that in the end, the conflict triggered by the tariffs looked that it was going to be global, but it ended up focused on the central fight of this century, the competition between the US and China. And one interesting thing about the history of this struggle is how difficult it is to create a proper timeline of the events that led to the current situation. Because essentially we have on one side a Western timeline, on the other side a Chinese timeline, and they share some key events, but they present in fact very different narratives. And the Western narrative is also muddled because of the tension that we just mentioned in the previous episode between the naked interests of the empire and their ideological justification. Especially when the conflict started, this was the case, since the dichotomy of democracy versus dictatorship was central for US discourse. After Obama, though, and when we enter in the Trump and Biden governments, the discourse of containment has been more focused on economic and hegemonic competition. So we thought it would be relevant to review the key milestones of the China-US relationship in order to have a better understanding of how we got here. And we are especially interested in presenting a Chinese perspective on the topic, not only because we live in China, but because we think it is important to discuss the variety of political discourses on China, both on a formal public level and on the exchanges we have in our everyday life. I will give a small disclaimer though. Part of our perspective is that it's impossible to make generalizations about a country with 1.4 billion inhabitants. Even more so when you don't focus only on the official state discourse.
Well, this is the age of information, this era of internet. Disclaimers are always necessary. And yeah, I bet you all must have had your quota of Western mainstream media shallow analysis and some China watchers from, I don't know, Salt Springs, Idaho, or Shitterton, England, real places by the way, who never set foot here, right? And I must say I'm very enthusiastic about the writer we are going to discuss today, Jiang Shigong. And I swear I'm working on my pronunciation of his name, okay? I don't want it to sound like Jiang Shigong or something. Cheng Shigong is one of the most prominent political theorists in China today. Going for his full biography, it would be too much, I think. But it's important to mention that he is the current president of Minzu University in Beijing, and it is an influential proponent of Xi Jinping thought. For this episode, we choose some articles from Jiang, which the names will be listed on our social media, of course, that are quite useful to get a glimpse of the Chinese perspective regarding this particular moment we are passing through in the international arena.
But before we dive deeper into the writings of Jiang, it would be nice to present a little bit of the US perspective on their competition with China, because this will make it easier for us to understand what the differences are between what Jiang Shigong thinks and the Western discourse that we are more used to here. What do you think?
Do we really need to talk about it? I mean, okay, if there's no other way, let's get into it.
Oh yeah, I really think we need to talk about it. We cannot do, though, a full review of the perspectives of the US since 1949, something that personally I would love. But we can take some representative papers since 2009, that is when Obama took power, until 2019. This covers a similar period than the one defined by Jiang Shigong as the critical decade of 2008-2018. So according to what we research, and also this is something that Cheng says, by 2008, we can see how the US started to develop a certain awareness that their policy regarding China was not giving the expected results. But it would be misleading to think that before that, the US had a unified policy, or that there were no doubts about their China policy. But every time the relationship faced a crisis, for example in 1989 or after the ascension to the WTO, the policy of engagement would win in the end. In a congressional report of 2009, it is indicated that there were three positions inside the US government regarding China. Some thought that the engagement policy was moving China to eventually make liberal reforms in the political system, and that had been the majority position up to that point. On the other hand, the other two sides were concerned with China's rising importance in the global economy and in the East Asian region. The first group thought that even if China's rise was peaceful, it would represent a threat to the US. And the second group thought that China's rise hid some evil intentions. Or in other words, that the hidden objective of the Chinese government was to replace the US as a global superpower.
I don't know. I have to say that while reading this thing about the clarity that they discussed at China, it's something that really stood out for me. Even the group that say that China rise, even if it was peaceful, should be stopped. Come on, this is crazy, right? That attitude, it really shows how entitled the US is about their position as the only global superpower. And even the group that thought China was evil or secretly evil or something, there was not much evidence going on. And as the resident expert on security here, that was even more glaring to me on that topic, since we saw how the US worked hard to safeguard the interests in the Asia-Pacific region over the past years. In fact, what happened was the implementation of a rebalanced strategy. It is known already that after 1945 and the series of conflicts the US got its hands on until mid-70s, was a not so secret attempt to establish its dominance over the Asia-Pacific. In a memorandum to Obama, dating from 2013, some analysts were arguing about the importance of this reassessment of influence, which presented itself in the form of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some of you may remember of that. Although the focus of this failed agreement was mainly trade and commercial relations, we can't forget about the nature of US hegemony. This memorandum I just mentioned has two sections dedicated to the security aspect of this partnership, such as proposing the strengthening of the Japanese and further development of the Republic of Korea, South Korea, military capabilities. And of course, it's also mentioned how the Chinese modernization efforts over the last years were making this "let's keep East Asia under our control" task a difficult one for them.
Those are very good points, and I think it really comes through in the reports how the US had these security and economic levels connected. But I think it's interesting to know that the main mechanisms that the Obama government chose to strengthen the US security position in East Asia was an economic mechanism. And this will also be the trend with Trump. Although, if you think about it, the Trans-Pacific Partnership of Obama and the tariffs from Trump go in opposite directions from the point of view of economic thought. And that in both cases, they are using economic mechanisms, calls back to the quote of Make Things Good that we mentioned the other week. One of the characteristics of the US empire is that it has a preference for economic mechanisms when exerting their hegemony. But economy and security are intimately related in the ideology of US foreign policy, so it's not that the motivation for action was only economic.
Maybe this is a little bit of non sequitur or will sound a bit off topic, but I can't forget mentioning that the first group of US officials cited in this 2009 report had somewhat of a good point. This may come as a surprise for many, and it was a little bit of a surprise for me too. But Chinese liberals are real. And despite all the propaganda on Chinese censorship, it is pretty easy to come across them while living in China, which honestly makes me a bit sad. And these groups that we will discuss later, when we dive more into Jiang Shigong's writings, were essential in the rewriting of the last 15 years of history of the US-China relations. Because if you have been listening up to this point, you may be wondering, wait a minute, wasn't China the aggressor in the conflict between US and China? And we really try to find some evidence on that. But in fact, the only way of framing China as the aggressor that makes somehow any kind of sense with the facts is to assume that developing your economy or setting some influence in the region in which your country is situated, by the way, a region that is not where the US is situated, it would be aggression. And that would be weird. Although I assume that it makes sense for the US, right? Everything can make sense if you're crazy enough. Another way of making the sense of US reactions to China would be to blame the Chinese reaction to this expansionism. And that is what is done in a Brookings Institute article from 2016, in which the author, who is now a professor in a Hong Kong university, says that China misunderstood Obama's pivot to Asia as a plan against China, while it was nothing of the sort. The tendency in that article, and this would be a constant since 2009 till now, is to normalize US policy as reasonable and to decry China's answers to that policy as irrational and harmful to the whole world, which we know they are not.
I feel the need to clarify that none of the above implies a defense of Chinese policies. We're just saying that Chinese policy is rational and it is an answer to US policy. And in fact, and I know you agree with me on this, from a realist position, the US strategy makes some amount of sense because realism, as we discussed before, tends to think of great power politics as a zero-sum game. But what we're trying to do here is more to question the narrative surrounding this strategy and why some people in the left or in the global south or even in China, they have adopted the Western narrative as if it's an objective description of what happened. For me, though, the most crazy thing is that we live through this period. I remember the Obama government. So it's weird that people are not remembering correctly what happened. It's not as if we're talking about the war of resistance against Japan or something else.
Ah, yes, the Obama memories. And right, we should definitely talk about that war. You know I have a lot to say about it. But before moving to the next section, I feel that I need to clarify something for our listeners. It's not paranoia or excess of realism to take precautions if you can see all the signs that your adversary is preparing to do something bad to you. Or worse, in the Chinese case, the US did and is still doing a lot of things. Again, let's remember that Uncle Sam worked hard, both in theory and practice, to put forth his containment strategies. Nicholas Speakman was insistent about the importance of controlling the rimland, that is basically the entire Eurasian coast, which means most of China. And how could you not mention Foster Jules and his island chain strategy? I hope your listeners have a clear word map in your minds right now, because I do have one. So imagine that most of the islands from the East China Sea to Australia are divided into lines, or as the name says, chains, to contain and maintain China and at the time Soviet Union too in check. US military isn't bothering everyone in Japan right now just because they are fond of sushi. This is all part of keeping the balance of power working. And just to mention, Dulles was also one of the responsible for transforming Japan into an US military outpost. Okay, I think I clarified enough. For now, let's move to the next section and discuss Jiang Shigong's texts in order to better understand how some Chinese intellectuals are conceptualizing the conflict between US and China. Well, we are back and ready to dive into Jiang Shigong's writing. I'm especially enthusiastic about talking about him, since I think one of the most important goals of this podcast is to give some publicity to Chinese intellectuals, which are usually ignored by the West, of course, but also in the global South. I think this is a major deficit that we need to confront, not only because China is so important in world politics right now, but because they actually make some good contributions to scholarship.
I totally agree, and I have to disclose that this is not my first time dealing with Jiang. I'm a repeat offender, because in the past I translated one of his texts for Reading the China Dream, a webpage that has pioneered this approach of translating and explaining what Chinese intellectuals think, instead of just focusing on what the Chinese government is saying. Even if one may disagree with theories like the one espoused by Jiang, and on a personal level, I have many disagreements with him. It is still important to understand him since he's a representative of certain tendencies within Chinese society. And in order to provide some order to our discussion, we will present Chang ideas in two parts. The first part will be on the topic of empire and civilization, and the second will be the China-U.S. competition and the Chinese intellectual environment. So part one will be more theoretical, while the second will continue the topics that we discussed in the previous section. As always, all the texts we are discussing will be in the description of the episode. Do you want to kick off by presenting your perspective on what is Chang talking about when he talks about empire and civilization?
Well, if there's no other way, we can say that Jiang takes seriously the relevance of hegemony in the formation of civilizations and empires. To put it differently, the history of human civilization is the evolution from regional civilized empires to world empires. This argument gives us a framework to understand better concepts such as globalization, and it's also good to analyze the dynamics of the US behavior since the period after World War II. The British are mentioned again, and for me, I don't know, I could even say that in some extent this paper complements Maxim's Wood point about the difference between Britain and the US. I want your answer on that. But they mention the British as the founders of the First World Empire. Following an alternate path from their predecessor, Uncle Sam chose to build an intangible empire, which means they are relying in different forms of exercising their power and influence other than colonization and wars of conquest. And imperialist movements during the course of the last century and the high costs of establishing and maintaining such a global empire, of course, in the same way as the British one, can explain why the US preferred to keep a globalized system based on technological, financial, and cultural hegemony. In other words, as we know already, capitalism. And the big question for China: should they follow this order and become the successor or new bearer of the hegemon's mantle? Or it would be better to upset the balance and strive for multipolarity, while still keeping their autonomy. And by autonomy, I mean civilizational, political, and developmental autonomy. Maintain the current liberal hegemony framework or embrace a shared future for mankind? I think we know the answer, right?
Wow, that was a really complete exposition. I feel I don't have anything to add. Nah, you know that I always have something to add, especially if it's to criticize something. And while I was reading Cheng's writing, my first thought was, this guy could really use an editor. His articles are so long. But jokes aside, he has a very powerful style, I agree, and while reading, it is very easy to start to feel convinced by his rhetoric. But for me, there were also some weaknesses, and maybe these become apparent when you read it several times, or if you're a hater, like I am, just the first reading will suffice. One thing that I found very interesting to analyze, and you talked a little bit about this, is how Chang describes the British and the US empires, and how that contrasts with Maxim's Wood definition that we talked in the first episode. And you mentioned that it's a complement, but I think there are some key differences between the two conceptions. Maybe the strongest difference is that Chang focuses more on the political, ideological aspects of imperialism, while Maxim's Wood does the proper Marxist thing, let's say, of dealing with economic aspects of imperialist domination. That is one reason, I think, for the categorization that Chang makes of the British Empire as an intermediate type between the old and new types of empires, between the formal and informal empires in his terminology. Because ideologically, the British Empire has the universalizing tendency that Chang contrasts with the regional empires of old, even though it was still based on territorial control. Nevertheless, Maxim's Wood presents, for me at least, a better explanation, in the sense that she describes the economic imperatives of capitalism as radiating from the center to the periphery. So it's not, as Chang said, that the British focus more on constructing a new control model for the division of labor in the economic industrial change, but that there was a certain contradiction between the imperatives of capitalism and the demands of territorial imperialism.
Okay, well, what you say makes sense. And this goes back to the point we made in the previous episode about how there are different definitions of empire and imperialism, and how we need to be clear when we compare authors to identify how they are using these concepts, right?
Totally. And I also think that it's important to recognize that one of the main points of Jiang, that empire and civilization are intertwined concepts, it does make sense. Because it is impossible to disentangle the Western definition of concepts like democracy, freedom, or human rights from the universalist imperial project. Hegemony, and we know this since at least the Bolsheviks started using the word in its modern sense, is not only economic, but it's also political and cultural. So it's totally reasonable to think that the only way to oppose US imperialism is to propose an alternative civilizational model. But for me, this presents a new possible issue. And one of the main ones is this Chinese civilization project viable at all? So to understand this, I feel the need to clarify that here I'm not talking about the empirical reality of the 5,000-year Chinese civilization that we often hear about. This idea is besides the point in the sense that every nation's identity is not something that has to be approved by a committee of skeptical foreign historians. As Benedict Anderson says, it's more of an imagined community. So if the idea is empirically correct or not is not so important. For example, if the Tianxia model that many Chinese talk about as the imperial model of foreign policy was real in the past or not, it's not so important. And I'm not talking also about the exportability of the Chinese civilization and if it can be adopted by other countries or not, because that already assumes that the project of Cheng is universalistic. And this is something that I think he wouldn't agree with. What concerns me more is if this idea of a Chinese civilization can be embraced by the Chinese people themselves. And in particular, and this is something that Chang has a special focus about, is if the middle classes in China would embrace this project. While reading Chang's criticism of the middle class, I could not help but think about how in Argentina we call these people cipayos. That's a word that comes from Portuguese. And for us, it means that they like a foreign culture more than their own. But I don't know if you use this word on Portuguese or you have your own word.
Well, at least in Brazil, cipaio, it has a different meaning. Today, we have an equivalent. For me, it would be síndrome de vira-lata. I don't know. And vira-lata is the word we use to call all the street dogs with no defined race. So, I don't know. This is something crazy for me to understand. And maybe understand is even not the best word. I mean, we have that saying, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. As I said before, we do have liberals here in China, and these people do think the liberal worldview and the values put forth by the constant stream of Western news and media are way better than the nation's own history and values. Crazy. But my point is not to frame them as brainwashed by the West or something. But we should observe how effective are the features of this intangible empire the U.S. took so much effort into building it. As you mentioned it to me the other day, my friend, it's everything about Fukuyama and Huntington. Internally, for them, history is sober, and the liberal paradigm is the perfect world order. Externally, it is a perpetual clash of civilizations. And I would add that they believe they have the sacred mission of spreading, disseminating this perfect doctrine to all corners of the world. You see, some ideas from the 19th century Europe are still in vogue. Maybe with a new fitting, but still the same core concepts.
It is very timely that you mention Fukuyama and Huntington because I think this is one of the central tensions that Chang describes between the ideas of Fukuyama and Huntington and how, as you say, well, this is a good model to understand one works internally and the other externally. Also, I think that maybe one day we can talk about how these two authors became so important for the Chinese intellectual discourse, but because at least in Argentina, we don't pay them so much attention. And even in the US, they are mostly think about obsolete, maybe. So that is something that we can focus in a future episode. But going back to the other topic, no, this idea of U.S. influence in China, I think one of the historical advantages that the U.S. has in this competition against China is that it is able to influence the Chinese population. And historically, the policy of engagement that we talked about before has had a great influence and has changed the perspective of many Chinese people. And sometimes this gets turned into talking about propaganda, about the CIA, or about US aid or influence operations. And of course, these are factors. But I think that Cheng is right in making this about the nature of US imperialism itself and how it tends to universalize itself. In a sense, when you read Chang, you can feel that the policy of engagement that the US had until 2009 was somewhat effective. It was not failing totally. And this goes back to the idea of that the anxiety and fear of the US sometimes works against their own interests, because we can maybe suppose or say a what if they had kept their policy of engagement going, well, maybe things would be very different right now. But when we think about how much the reaction of the US to China is based on assuming that the objectives of Chinese policy are the same as the objectives of Chinese policy, we understand how we can think that they are both competing for the title of global hegemon.
Yeah, like this thing you just said, it makes total sense. The projections of the US, like the actions, the paranoia, it's always hurting themselves. It goes straight back to them. And yes, we can go back to this U.S. China competition topic. I think we can understand it much more now that we have made this historical summary. Even if you don't agree with Cheng and everything, it is clear that he has some good points when he analyzes the motivation behind the last 70 years of U.S. policy towards China. But it also explains why some Chinese have this "why are you so obsessed with me" feeling, you know?
Last time we talked about how the US position toward China was characterized by a rational fear. And in the Chinese case, I think that it was the dynamics of the pivot to Asia that made China take measures to strengthen itself. What Jiang Shigong in his writings brings to the fore is the fact that self-strengthening is not just having better technology or better military, but you also need ideological and political strengthening. As he says in one of his articles, it is necessary for the Chinese elites to move from the idea of development is the hard truth. That's a quote from Deng Xiaoping in his 1992 Southern Tour, to the idea of power is the hard truth. This does not mean that the ideals of development should be abandoned, but that they have to be thought about as a means to an end and not ends in themselves.
My friend, you and your quotes. Probably our listeners are thinking that you were there in the 92 tour, right? But since I like this one, I will let it pass. And going back to Cheng, and he has something to add about that too. We can say that this is all about the oppression under the imperial world order. I will probably call it a die-hard realist for saying this, but power matters, and it matters a lot. This is not about becoming the next hegemon or following the footsteps of the previous empire. I'm talking about having the means to hold your ground and resist external pressures. We as Latin Americans are unfortunately familiar with being bullied and having our politics and ideologies constantly messed up by someone who used to call himself our big brother. Recently, DoD Secretary Hegseth referred to us, Latin America, as America's backyard. If you think there's other solution to this kind of threats other than mustering your own power, then I'm all ears, because honestly, I don't know. And well, I believe our time is up. We would love to read what do you people have to say about it. So please don't be afraid to comment and give us your opinions. And to like and subscribe of course. As we did on the previous episode, all the bibliography will be available on your social media, and if you have a suggestion or question, feedback, you can also send us an email at southwestisred@gmail.com. I hope I can see you all next week. And that's it. 再见, comrades.
再见。